What would a world without prisons look like? Known internationally for her long-standing and ongoing work to combat all forms of oppression in the US and abroad, and marked as one of the most important intellectuals of our time, Angela Davis has for almost 6 decades not only believed that reimagining justice through the abolition of prisons means imagining a society that no longer relies on repressive efforts of violence and incarceration, but also the transformation of our built environment. Davis's intellectual and activist contribution, therefore, is an invaluable source for us architects, showing that reimagining justice is ultimately about transforming society entirely, envisioning forms of justice that are transformative and restorative. And critically, Angela Davis' body of work demonstrates how Black feminist thought has always offered the tools we need for radical change. In the lineage of Black feminist thinkers, Davis is one of the most prominent figures. Black feminism is abolitionist. It reveals the connections between state violence and violence in the intimate sphere, between prisons and domestic abuse and control, and between local and global structures for support, care, and organizing. Over the years, her work addresses the history of abolitionist practice, details the unique contributions of women to abolitionist struggles, showing how we must build the capacity to dream and struggle on a planetary scale, beyond the borders of nation states. Born in 1944 in Birmingham, Alabama, Davis grew up in a society where segregation was racial, spatial, and upheld and protected by civic society and law enforcement. Jim Crow racial segregation laws were still in force, and Birmingham, under Jim Crow, was also the most racially segregated city in America. Transgressions of racial borders could lead to an arrest, or much worse. And despite her early life experience of segregation, and also racial terror, Angela Davis has said elsewhere, she wouldn't have wanted to grow up anywhere else. In an interview she recalls, and I quote, "We moved through a landscape of resistance, above all in our homes and in our communities. My mother embodied resistance so powerfully, she helped us imagine new worlds, new ways of living. She always said, it doesn't have to be this way. We can change things." Landscape of resistance. That's powerful. Growing up and moving through landscapes of resistance cultivated by her family and community, Davis's work demonstrates how space and the built environment are integral to combating all forms of oppression, and how all struggles for justice are also spatial struggles. Many of you may be familiar with this image by Gordon Parks, who was a groundbreaking photographer of the post-war era, and he's best remembered for his commitment to social justice, documenting American culture from the 1940s until his death in 2006. In 1955, in the wake of the bus boycott in Montgomery, Life magazine commissioned Parks to go to Alabama and document the racial tensions entrenched there. Parks chronicled the daily life of the Thornton family, and published in 1956, titled "The Restraints, Open and Hidden," he exposed the restrictive oppressions of Jim Crow on Black families, who, like the Thorntons, shared ambitions, responsibilities, and routines, no different from any American. However, the images revealed the social inequality that was unnoticed or simply ignored and condoned by many in the majority culture, and in my mind, it also shows quietly the landscape of resistance of the civil rights movement. In her work, Davis has developed the concept of the prison industrial complex in analogy with the military industrial complex, and traces the prison system's racist root in southern plantations of slavery. Although the institution of slavery was abolished in 1865, it is still thriving in US prisons, thanks to the 13th Amendment, making a special allowance for penal labor. The documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay from 2016 opens with a speech where President Obama states, "The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners." Think about that. And DuVernay's film is much influenced by the work of Davis and other abolitionists, and maps out the myriad ways in which that loophole has been exploited over time, and leading to the creation of the current system of mass incarceration in the US and effectively the re-enslavement of predominantly racialized bodies. Architect and scholar Mabel O. Wilson argues in her essay Carceral Architectures from 2016 that the gap in understanding the implications of incarceration's impact on Black and Hispanic Americans may have to do in part with who designs prisons, but critically is also influenced by architecture's own genealogy in racialized modern discourses of history and science. Centuries of disenfranchisement and race-based violence is manifested in the built environment where racial injustices are embedded in almost every aspect of the design of American society. But this can also be witnessed globally. Ethnic and racially segregated neighborhoods, displacement of communities and displacement of peoples, compromised infrastructures, environmental toxins, unequal access to housing, healthcare, financial and educational institutions. For architects who are concerned about architecture's role in reproducing carceral architectures, dismantling racism depends on transforming the built environment, disproportionately affecting the Black community that are imprisoned roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans. The prison is the most obvious expression of a structurally racist system, and therefore it is with the prison such dismantling must begin. I want to briefly look back to the early days of Davis's career. In 1969, she was at age 25 hired as an assistant professor of philosophy at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, but was only after a short period fired from a position because of her membership in the Communist Party. She was later accused for playing a supporting role in a courtroom kidnapping that resulted in 4 deaths. And viewed as a political prisoner, the international campaign to secure her release from prison was led by, among many others, her sister, Thania Davis. In 1972, after a 16-month incarceration, the state allowed her release on bail. Davis was eventually acquitted. Short thereafter, she gave a speech behind a 4-sided, 7-foot-high, bulletproof glass shield at Madison Square Garden. The gathering that attracted more than 15,000 people was part of several nationwide appearances to help carry the cost of her recent trial organized by the Angela Davis Legal Defense Fund. Davis's own experience of incarceration was the pivot for her scholarship on prison abolition. And critically, for Davis, the prison system cannot simply be reformed. It must be abolished. Today, Davis uses the phrase the abolitionist imagination to describe the mentality needed to see beyond current forms of law enforcement. In an interview with the New York Times, she explained the importance of imagination to her politics. And I quote, "The abolitionist imagination delinks us from that which is." And she continues, "It allows us to imagine other ways of addressing issues of safety and security. It requires the ability to dream outside of how society is currently organized and think beyond the belief and value systems that positions prisons and jails as the solutions to social problems." What would a world without prisons look like? Calls to defund the police, abolish the penal system, and demolish prisons are slogans that for some may seem provocative and radical. Others might even dismiss them as disruptive, irrational, and unrealistic. However, what critics fail to acknowledge are the ways in which abolition is more about rebuilding than it is about dismantling. It's about re-envisioning, reimagining, and reconceptualizing, calling for government investments in jobs, education, housing, healthcare. Abolition means not just the dismantling of prisons, but the presence instead of vital systems of support that have been eroded. So how then could a reimagining a world without prisons be put into practice? For decades, Davis has promoted feminist thinking that pushes back against hypermasculine forms of political leadership and resistance. She sees this taking hold in recent radical organizing among younger generations, such as the Occupy and the Black Lives Matter movement, which has moved beyond recognizable leadership and broken new ground in forming leaderless movements. In 1997, Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and other activists founded the organization Critical Resistance to address issues of mass incarceration and policing. For Gilmore, abolition is deliberately everythingist. It's about the entirety of human environmental relations. And she writes, if justice is embodied, it is then therefore always spatial, what is to say, part of the process of making place. For Davis, this process is also about completely uprooting our current dominant ways of organizing society by way of law and order thinking in order to plant and nurture seeds of collective care. Concepts that scholars like Christina Sharp and Saidiya Hartman thoughtfully meditate on in their work, which, as Davis's work and also Gilmore's work, exceeds the boundaries of the academy. Over the years, Davis's work has detailed the unique contributions of women and feminist practices to abolitionist struggles. In Abolition Feminism Now, written in 2022 by Davis with her life partner Dina Dent, and with Beth Ritchie and Erica Miners, they write, justice in the form that we know it is always designed to deal with one individual case, leaving all the structures intact that are responsible for the reproduction of that violence. Davis's sister, Fania Davis, has advocated for decades for justice to not only be transformative, but also restorative, and describes restorative justice as a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. Abolitionists are mostly concerned about reducing violence and want to create a world that addresses the root causes of that violence. Therefore, what abolitionists ultimately want is to focus on changing the environments that led to that violence in the first place through restorative justice programs. Such has over the years also become integral to Angela Davis' advocacy and intellectual practice. Imagining a world without prisons, architect Diana Van Buren designs alternatives that promote healing instead of punishment. Inspired by works of both Angela and Fania Davis, Van Buren has, together with her team at the nonprofit DGDS, Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, based in Oakland in California, designed and realized projects such as Restore Oakland, one of the first centers for restorative justice and restorative economics. For Van Buren, to bring change, new building types need to be imagined. And by asking, what if we were to design for a restorative justice system, what would that look like? She shows how the abolitionist imagination put into practice requires subtler understanding, and it's really about planting and nurturing seeds of collective care. The work by Van Buren and her team shows how nothing can anchor such values more than design and architecture. It is permanent, and it communicates to people. Critically, What such spaces communicate is shaped by its location in the city. And according to her and her team, restorative justice spaces need to be hyper-local, not in the usual downtown justice complex. For Van Buren, when people walk into these spaces, it must say something to them to encourage choosing to engage in a process of restoration that is unfamiliar to them. What do these environments look like? Where do they need to be in order for us to embrace this as a way of healing and addressing harm in our communities? Their work shows how architecture and design have a huge role to play in that. Designing for a restorative justice system, they seek to create new prototypes to counter societal inequities manifested in dominant architectural models of justice by engaging communities in the design and development of buildings that integrate restorative justice, economics, and education, re-entry housing, and reconciliation facilities. The work of Diana Van Buren and the team of Designing Justice, Designing Spaces shows us how to put abolition into practice and design practice, architecture and design practice. It shows the importance of integrated processes, anchoring and giving material form to values in society that build, nurture, and seed sustainable infrastructures. It offers us the abolitionist imagination materialized that we can fully embody. I also would have liked to say something about the role of art and philosophy for Angela Davis in envisioning change. That is also what Davis gave a talk on with the title Art, Philosophy, and Politics when she visited Stockholm and the Royal Institute of Art back in 2015 when I was a graduate student there. It impacted me deeply, but I will never be able to make it justice. I can only mention this to express my deepest gratitude. And needless to say, Davis's intellectual contribution and activism, the role of imagination, art, philosophy, politics, has had a deep impact on my own thinking and doing before her visiting Stockholm. But the emphasis she brought to art, imagination, and radical change has stayed with me ever since. So instead, I will say this. Angela Davis's invaluable contribution to architecture is her assertion that while the abolitionist imagination might begin with reimagining the roles of punishment and prisons in our societies, it is not simply about dismantling the prison as a social institution. She shows how abolitionism is feminist, it is transformative, and it is a creative project that asked architects to imagine and design alternative forms for justice. As architects, we must therefore ask ourselves, if we don't wish to perpetuate the white supremacist values that underpin causal logics and architectures, what kind of values do we wish to organize around? The abolitionist models for justice Angela Davis had dedicated her career advocating for can inform the design of spaces that not only rethinks punishment, but also challenges architects to design and envision alternatives for justice that centers values of collective care, healing, and repair. Thank you.